Thank you for joining us today. At Lakewood's Drive this morning, we were talking about the blessing of sleep. And trust me, there's nobody out there who appreciates a good night's sleep more than I do. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time this afternoon following up with that thought by pointing out that sleep in the Bible, strictly speaking, doesn't have a very good reputation. Actually, sleep is presented almost uniformly in a negative sense. Sleep is what happens when you should be busy, when you should be doing something, and particularly doing something in the service of Jesus Christ. What I'd like to do for a few minutes here this afternoon is take you through some passages, starting with Romans chapter 13, and looking at the way that sleep is presented for us here, and how we need to avoid the curse of sleep. The first curse is sleeping through your alarm clock, and this is the way that it's couched in Romans chapter 13. We have a job as Christians, and that job is to leave the world and come into this new relationship that's characterized by holiness and righteousness and peace and love and all the other great things we read about in the fruit of the Spirit and other places as well. This is our lifestyle, and we cannot get to that point if we persist in sin. And separating ourselves from sin and still trusting in the power and the grace of God is an interesting balance that Paul plays with a lot in the book of Romans here. But it always comes down to us making a choice as Christians for godliness. And if you have been living your life as a Christian very long at all, you should have been aware of this. And if you were not aware of this, if you thought that you could, as he says earlier in the text, sin the more that grace may increase, then it's time for you to wake up. And that's what he says in Romans chapter 13, verse number 11, after having emphasized how we continue to keep God's commandments, not committing adultery, not stealing, etc., loving your neighbor as yourself. He says, do this, verse 11, knowing the time, that it is already the hour for you to awaken from sleep, for now salvation is nearer to us than when we believed. The night is almost gone, and the day is near. Therefore, let us lay aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us behave properly as in the day, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual promiscuity and sensuality, not in strife and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh in regard to its lusts. What he's saying there is that we, as the people of God, have woken up. We have come to a realization of what sin is and what our relationship to sin was and what our relationship to sin is. And now, because of that, because of Jesus and his death on the cross, we are living in daylight. And that means us living deeds that are performed in the light. And there is a stereotype, there is a generalization that has a great deal of root in fact, of course, that sin takes place in the dark. Sin takes place when people can't see what you are doing because we're ashamed of what we're doing. Now, a lot of people are perfectly unashamed. They're willing to parade their sin in the light. But generally speaking, we as Christians realize that's a bad thing. And so we perform our sins in the darkness. Well, we need to wake up. We need to come into the light. Jesus is light. He has brought us into the light. We're called to walk in the light as he himself is in the light. And because of that, we need to quit doing the things that are done in the dark. And he emphasizes this point a little bit more in Ephesians chapter 5, verse number 11 and following. Do not participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness, but instead even expose them, for it is disgraceful even to speak of the things which are done by them in secret, but that is done by sinners in secret. But all things become visible when they are exposed to the light, for everything that becomes visible is light. For this reason, it says, awake, sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Therefore, be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of your time, because the days are evil. We're living in sinful times, and such has always been the case, I suppose, ever since Adam and Eve. It's been a sinful world that we live in. And what we need to do is come out of that sin as much as we can. Now, we're never going to live perfect, sinless lives, obviously. We walk in the light compared to Jesus, who is in the light, who is light himself. But nevertheless, this is where we live, and this is where we want to live. And we as Christians appreciate our role to a very large degree is to expose darkness, expose the deeds of darkness in our own lives, in our own reckoning, in our own understanding of what sin is and what righteousness is, and also in the lives of others. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3 talks about those ones who are confused at our failure to indulge in that same kind of extensive repertoire of perversity. That's the time has passed. We have done that. I'm not sure what your past is, and you're probably not sure what my past is, but all of us, before we came into Jesus, in one sense or another, to one degree or another, embraced darkness. That's why we hadn't come to Jesus, because we hadn't yet embraced light. And now, having embraced the light, we come into the light. That's odd for the people who live in the darkness, the people who love the darkness. We find that exchange in the Nicodemus passage in John chapter 3. The idea of Jesus providing light, and the people who live in darkness love the darkness. They don't want their deeds exposed. But that's our job, and it's certainly our job as individuals to wake up to the reality of sin, to wake up to the reality of our own personal responsibility, our own personal accountability to God. The alarm clock's ringing, and it's not appropriate for us to just hit the snooze, hit the snooze, hit the snooze. Well, God will let me get away with this. I'll snooze. God will let me get away with this too. I'll snooze it again. That's not what we do. Not what we should do, at least. We should appreciate that Jesus is calling us into this new lifestyle. And it's high time that we started living in that lifestyle. And if we haven't started already, or if we have fallen astray, then by all means we need to right the ship as quickly and completely as possible. Now, that's one point that I'd like to look at. And I'd like to look also at the idea of work. And I'll refer you to a relatively familiar passage in Proverbs chapter 24 and verse number 30 and following. The idea of work is not always pleasant. Certainly to some people, and I'm sure to all of us to one degree or another, we would rather sleep. We go through this every Monday morning, right? Am I going to wake up and go to work? Am I going to wake up and go to school? Or am I just going to stay in bed? Well, there is work that is our task to accomplish here in this life, whether we're talking about a particular day or a particular week or an entire lifetime. There is a call to work, and we must be ready to answer that. Now, there are going to be days when you don't feel like doing that, just like there are going to be days when I don't feel like doing that. But snoozing, slumber, can become a very bad habit if we're not careful. Solomon writes about this in Proverbs 24, verse 30 and following. I passed by the field of the sluggard and by the vineyard of the man lacking sense, and behold, it was completely overgrown with thistles. Its surface was covered with nettles, and its stone wall was broken down. When I saw it, I reflected upon it. I looked and received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. Then your poverty will come as a robber, and your want like an armed man. Now, Solomon is not suggesting here, obviously, that if you sleep in one particular Monday morning, you're going to lose your family farm. That's not what he's saying. It couldn't be, because we know that's not true. That's not the way farming works. That's not the way life works. But what does happen when you sleep in on a Monday morning is you encourage yourself to sleep in the next Monday morning. And before too long, you're not checking into work at all. And then you're checking out early on a Friday too. And before too long, you're hardly working at all. Work becomes the exception rather than the rule. And it may get to the point where you get so indolent, so lazy, so haphazard with your lifestyle that work becomes almost a freak, an accident that we go out and work. And before too long, we're broke. We're bankrupt. And we're talking in financial terms here largely, but we're broke spiritually as well, aren't we? When we refuse to work on our salvation, we refuse to work on our soul, on our commitment to God, before too long, we don't have any commitment to God. When that ethic of working, of driving toward a goal, trying to finish a project, when we lose sight of that, before too long, we're not on the project at all. And when exactly it happens, when the transition happens, there's no way of knowing. That's why you show up to work every day. That's why you embrace the concept of work every day. Jesus uses similar terminology in a spiritual context in John chapter 9, verse 4, that we must work the works of him who has sent us. The night is coming when no man can work. The idea there is that our life is like a day. It starts and it proceeds, and there are high points and there are low points. And before too long, the sun starts going down and we start running out of time. And you can quit early, you can slack off, or you can press toward the end. And that's what he is asking us to do. We have a task in front of us that we are not going to be able to accomplish. We're not going to be able to finish this. Are we going to just assume that it doesn't matter? Or are we going to drive to the finish? Are we going to try to do as much as we possibly can? Be those 11th hour workers who are still out there, still wanting to work. Maybe it accomplishes a great deal, maybe it doesn't. But either way, we want to be found working as long as we possibly can. That's what Jesus himself was doing. As long as I'm in the world, I'm the light of the world, he says in the next verse. Well, we need to be the light of the world also. We need to be shining our light as brightly and as consistently as we possibly can. Because at any given time, it's going to be time for us to show up and be accountable and be responsible, be dutiful in our service. There is a long series of parables that Jesus tells along these lines. I'll refer you to one of them in Matthew chapter 24 and verse number 42. The idea of preparedness, being ready in the moment, being ready and working in the moment. Therefore, be on the alert, Jesus says in verse 42 of Matthew 24. For you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time at what time at night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would have and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. And this kind of leads us into the third point, the point with regard to when Jesus is actually going to be needing us to be there. And how this works is going to be an individual thing. It's going to be a situational kind of thing. Exactly what God wants of me, exactly what Jesus wants of me at any given moment, who's to say? But it's clear from the text that there are going to be moments when we are going to be called upon. And in those moments, we have to be ready. Luke chapter 22 describes one of those particular moments, a particularly sad moment. In fact, as Luke tells the story, the apostles have followed Jesus into the Garden of Gethsemane. And 3 of them particularly are called a little bit further into the garden so that they can wait with him. He asks them to keep watch, to stay awake. They're going to be needed, or at least they may be needed. And it's my personal conviction that Jesus has concerns for his physical welfare. He may not make it to the cross. We see on this occasion that angels had appeared to him, strengthening him. His body was failing him. Exactly how this was going to be accomplished, he didn't know, not all of it at least. And he thought that perhaps his friends being there on the spot might be able to render aid if such became necessary. But we find in verse number 44 that they were not going to be ready in that moment. Luke chapter 22 and verse number 44. And being in agony, he was praying very fervently, and his sweat became like drops of blood falling down upon the ground. When he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping from sorrow, and said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not enter into temptation." What an interesting concept that is, and I don't know exactly what that means. I have one interpretation that makes more sense than anything else in my mind, and I'll offer it to you. You can do what you will with it. But Jesus clearly is in trauma. He is in physical and emotional trauma at this moment because of what he is doing for the rest of mankind. And Peter, James, and John are, the text says, sleeping from sorrow. It's kind of ironic there. Jesus is the one who is crying. Jesus is the one who's weeping and sweating, sweat like blood. But they are consumed with what appears to be their own sorrow. Some sad things have happened on this particular night. Jesus has accused them of being ready to betray him. One particularly is going to stab him in the back, metaphorically speaking, but all of them are going to desert him, he says. Perhaps that's what they're upset about. I don't know what else it would have been. But whatever it happened to be, their particular emotional state was sorrowful in that moment. And their response was not to be ready to be there for the Lord in this moment, but rather to be so consumed with their own sorrow that they fell asleep. They were only thinking of themselves in that moment. Falling into temptation, as Jesus warned them, you need to stay awake. They didn't stay awake the second time either, unfortunately. Are we so much better than they are? Are we consumed with our own sorrow? Are we consumed with our own situations, our own difficulties, hardships, pain, and suffering, that we are not available for the Lord? And sometimes we'll say it in so many words. I know that I need to work harder. I know that I need to prioritize Jesus. I know that I need to be worshiping with the saints. I know I need to be reading my Bible. But, and there's always a but, right? I have this situation in my life right now. I really have to deal with what's in front of me right now. I don't have time or energy or attention in my day to give to the Lord right now. We're falling asleep on the job, essentially. And this may be the very moment that Jesus needs us. This may be the very time in which we are called upon to be there for him. I don't know what that means exactly. It's going to be different for every person. But hypothetically, at least, isn't it possible that as you are going through whatever your version of torment is, whatever your trauma is, whatever your trial happens to be, if in that moment you can find the wherewithal to give God the glory, to do as Job did at the end of Job chapter 1, naked I came into this world, naked I shall return. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. If people can see you, if they can see us in that moment, giving God the glory, when there doesn't appear to be any glory, when we are able to think about him when ordinary people would be absolutely consumed with themselves, perhaps that is what is going to make a difference in somebody's life. Look at that person's faith. Look how devoted they are to God. Again, in the Job story, does Job serve God for nothing? This person here, Hal, is getting nothing out of his service to God, and still he keeps his faith. Still he stays faithful. Still he returns thanks to the Lord for what appears to be a whole bunch of nothing. Maybe that's what Jesus is asking for us in that moment. Maybe that's what we can accomplish for him, and maybe this is the only time that we can accomplish it. So even in these moments, especially in these moments, we need to find a way to stay awake. We need to find a way to stay on task. There's an interesting contrast between the idea of sleep in the text and the idea of rest. I mentioned before that sleep is pretty much universally seen as an option, a bad option to work. That you're not supposed to be sleeping, you're supposed to be working. That's the way that usually, not always, but usually, that's the way that the text uses this word. The word rest is very different, which may seem to be on the surface a synonym. The Bible does not use it in that way. The Bible uses rest as a reward. It is not a temporary stopgap. It is a permanent reprieve from work. And it comes at the end of the day. It comes after trial, after hardship, after our ordeal. Then that rest comes, the Sabbath rest of the Old Testament. And a similar rest is waiting for us, prophetically speaking, metaphorically speaking, in our walk with Christ. The writer tells us about this in Hebrews chapter 4, after having referred to the work of Joshua in verse number 8. If Joshua had given them rest, that is the people of old, the Israelites in the wilderness, he would not have spoken of another day after that. So there remains, he says, a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For the one who has entered his rest, verse 10, has himself also rested from his works as God did from his. Therefore, let us be diligent to enter that rest, so that no one will fall through following that same example of disobedience. Do not be like the Israelites who squandered their opportunity to draw close to God in the wilderness and wound up wasting an entire generation. We look to that promise. We look to that rest. And we know that God will give it to us at the end of our sojourn. So we don't beg God for relief from our hardships, although we may ask, and sometimes God will give it to us in a short-term kind of way. But we don't expect that our problems will go away. We don't even necessarily expect that our problems will get better in the short term. That's not our objective. Our objective is finding ways every day in all circumstances to keep working, to drive toward the end, so that when the time comes, God will give us a permanent and eternal rest. And we can describe what that rest is in other passages of the text that we're not going to get into here today. But you know about the heavenly promise. You know about the inheritance that is going to be ours after this life is over. Jesus promises us if we will give him this life, he will give us another life, an eternal life, a perfect life, a life in his presence and the presence of all of the godly people of all the ages. That is the trade that we make. That is the rest that we enter into. And we have confidence that when the time comes, we will enter into that rest if we stay working, if we will continue to do his deeds while we have opportunity, if we can manage to not fall asleep on the job. May God give us the strength to stay on task, to work hard, to not grow weary in well-doing, as he tells the Galatian brethren, to maintain this commitment to work, to encourage other people to work, and to not give ourselves a break. There's all kinds of catchphrases that we might use. I'm giving myself a token vice, or I'm taking a day off, or whatever it happens to be. If your boss or your teacher or whatever allows you to do that, your parents, whatever kind of authority figure you answer to, that's between you and them. But let's not presume to force God to give us time off. Let's stay on task, stay working, and when the time comes, enter into the rest that he's promised to us. That's my hope and prayer for you. Hope that you can shine your light in your corner of God's kingdom, wherever that happens to be. If there's anything we can do to help, please don't hesitate to reach out. In the meantime, God bless. Take care.